Hello everyone, it's Myung Jan. Today I am going to read S6 6000S The Secret Garden. Chapter 10 In the Garden. While the secret garden was coming alive and two children were coming alive with it, there was a man wandering about the world who for 10 years had kept his mind filled with dark and heartbroken thinking. He was a tall man with a drawn, unhappy face and crooked shoulder. And his name was Archibald Craven. He traveled to the most beautiful places in Europe, though he never remained anywhere for more than a few days. He chose the quietest and remotest spot, but he was so sad and so bitter that he never took in the beauty that surrounded him. Then one day a strange thing happened. He was in a wonderful valley in Austria, and he had been walking along through such beauty as might have lifted any man's soul out of shadow. He had walked a long way, but it hadn't lifted his. At last he had felt tired and had thrown himself down to rest on a carpet of moss by a stream. The valley was very, very still. He did not know when he fell asleep and when he began to dream. His dream was so real that he didn't feel as if he were dreaming. He thought he heard someone calling. The voice seemed very far away, but he heard it as distinctly as if it had been at his very side. Archie, he heard. And then again, sweeter and clearer than before. Arch. Lilias, he answered. Lilias, where are you? In the garden, the voice came back, like a sound from a golden flute. In the garden, and then the dream ended. When he awoke, a strange calm was upon him, and something more, a lightness, as if something had changed. He was remembering the dream, the real dream. In the garden, he said, wondering to himself. In the garden, but the door is locked, and the key is buried deep. He looked down at the stream that ran through the rich green moss. He saw birds come and dip their heads and drink in it, and then flick their wings and fly away. There was one lovely mass of blue forget-me-nots growing so close to the stream that its leaves were wet, and he found himself looking at them as he had looked at such things years ago. The valley seemed to grow quieter and quieter as he sat and stared at the bright, delicate blue of the flowers. I almost feel as if I were alive, he said in a whisper, and he passed his hand over his forehead. I'll go back to Misselthwaite in a few days. He was in Yorkshire again, and on his long railroad journey, he found himself thinking of his boy, as he had never thought of him in all the 10 years past. During those years, he had only wished to forget him. He had not meant to be a bad father, but he had not felt like a father at all. He had supplied doctors and nurses and luxuries, but he had shrunk from the mere thought of his son, and had buried himself in his own misery. He scarcely ever saw him, except when the boy was asleep, and all he knew of him, or thought he knew, was that he was an invalid who demanded to be given his own way in every detail. Perhaps I've been wrong for 10 years, he said to himself. Could it be possible that I may be able to do him good? As the train whirled him through mountain passes and golden plain, a sense of peace came over him, which brought a sort of courage and hope with it. Instead of giving way to thoughts of the worst, he actually found that he was trying to believe in better things. When he arrived at the manor, he called for Mrs. Medlock at once. She came to him somewhat excited and curious and flustered. How is Master Colin, Medlock? He inquired. Well, sir, Mrs. Medlock answered. He's different in a manner of speaking. Worse? He suggested. Well, you see, sir, he tried to explain. Neither the doctor nor the nurse nor me can exactly make him out. Where is he now? Mr. Craven asked. He's in the garden, sir. These days, he's always in the garden with Miss Mary and young Dickon. I'm sorry. Though not another human creature is allowed to go near for fear they will look at him. Mr. Craven scarcely heard her last words. In the garden, he said. He turned and went out of the room. He took his way, as Mary had done, through the door in the shrubbery and among the laurels and the fountain beds, he did not walk quickly, but slowly, feeling as if he were being drawn back to the place that he had so long forsaken. He knew where the door was, even though the ivy concealed it, but he could not remember exactly where the buried key lay. So he stopped and stood still, looking about him, and almost a moment after he had paused, he started and listened, asking himself if he were walking in a dream. The ivy hung thick over the door. The key was buried under the shrubs. No human being had passed through that door for 10 lonely years. And yet, inside the garden, there were sounds. They were the sounds of running, scuffling feet, chasing around and around under the trees, of the uncontrollable laughter of children trying not to be heard. What in heaven's name was he dreaming of? What did he hear? And then the moment came when the sounds forgot to hush themselves. The feet ran faster and faster. They were nearing the garden door. There was quick, strong young breathing, and a wild outbreak of laughing, shouts which could not be contained, and the door in the wall was flung wide open, the sheet of ivy swinging back, and the boy burst through it all at full speed and without seeing the outsider, dashed into his arms. He was a tall boy and a handsome one. He was glowing with life, and his running had sent splendid color leaping to his face. He threw the thick hair back from his forehead and lifted a pair of strange gray eyes that made Mr. Craven gasp for breath. This was not what Colin had expected. He had never thought of such a meeting. And yet, to come dashing out, winning a race, perhaps it was even better. He drew himself up to his very tallest. Mary, who had been running with him and had dashed through the door, too, believed that he managed to make himself look taller than he had ever looked before. Father, he said, I'm Colin. You can't believe it, can you? I scarcely can myself. I'm Colin. Colin put out his hand and laid it on his father's arm. Archibald Craven could not believe that this was his son standing so tall and proud and full of life before him. His soul shook with unbelieving joy. Take me into the garden, my boy. And so the children took him in. The place was a wilderness of autumn, golden purple and violet blue and flaming scarlet. Late roses climbed and hung and clustered, and the sunshine made it look like a temple of gold. Newcomer stood silent, just as the children had when they came into its grayness. He looked around and around. I thought it'd be dead, he said. I thought so at first, said Mary, but it came alive. It was Mary who brought it to life, Dickon said. And Dickon and Colin too, insisted Mary. And magic, said Colin, looking with wonder first at the garden, then at the tall man who stood beside him. Then they sat down under a tree, and Colin told his father everything. Now he said at the end of his story, it need not be a secret anymore. I'm never going to get into that chair again. I shall walk back with you, father, to the house. When Mrs. Medlock looked out the kitchen window moments later, she threw up her hands, gave a little shriek, and every servant within hearing bolted across the servants' hall, stood looking through the window with their eyes almost starting out of their heads. Across the lawn came the master of Misselthwaite, and he looked as many of them had never seen him, and by his side, with his head up in the air, his eyes full of laughter, walked as strongly and steadily as any boy in Yorkshire, Master Colin. The end.